we'll now have Julie Downs. Where are you? Julie Downs is going to talk about nudging. Hi.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here. This has been a really amazing meeting, talking to everybody from all these different perspectives has been really informative and just really fantastic for me. So I'm really glad to be here. I talked a little bit in one of the workshops about the theory behind nudging. What I'm going to give you guys is some examples of different approaches to nudging to give you some thoughts about ways that we might be able to change behavior a little bit sneaky around the back without people maybe even realizing that their behavior is being changed. So let me just first talk a little bit about what nudging is. We work with this definition of asymmetric paternalism. It's sort of related to the Sunstein and Thaler idea of libertarian paternalism, but we're really sort of taking a step back and saying it's asymmetric because what we're doing is we're targeting the behaviors of people who are walking through their lives and sort of without maybe a directed decision about what they're going to do. We're going to nudge them in a healthier direction. But for somebody who really has made a conscious decision they want to do what they want to do, we're going to let them go about their business. So that's where the asymmetry comes from. So what we're trying to do here is help prevent irrational actions without interfering with deliberate decisions. And so we refer to this as nudging. And by nudging, we just mean that little sort of push, just, the tiniest little thing. You can resist it if you want, but we're just going to push you a little bit in the direction that we want. We're not talking about the forced decision. So we're really just talking about just that little push in a direction that's going to get you a little bit healthier. So this is unrestricted freedom of the individual to make the decisions that they want. But the behavior we're looking for is consistent with longer-term self-interest. We're going to try to facilitate that kind of behavior. And we're going to use behavioral economics principles to guide a selection of effective nudges. So let me walk you through a few different examples, and some of these have come up a couple times already today. So one is just plate size. How big are the plates that we're eating? We all went and had that lovely snack after the workshop in that adorable tiny little cup. It was a very nice, healthy snack for us to have. People tend to fill their plates to what looks like the right amount of food, and that's sort of the norm of how much you should be eating. And that norm is going to depend on what you see. So here's two identical chicken dinners up here, but these chicken dinners are going to look very different depending on what we're putting them on. And so plate size can affect the perception. If we took that same chicken dinner on a big plate, it looks like nothing. Surely you should fill the rest of that plate with some additional food. But if you have it on a smaller plate, it might look like a more reasonable amount to eat and to stop at the end of eating that. So Brian Wansink and his colleagues have done a number of studies looking at plate size and looking at a couple of different measures. One is just looking at how much food people will take when they're serving themselves at a buffet. And so, for example, they had one buffet where they are just measuring the amount of trays, how often you have to replace a tray because the food has been eaten. And what they found is that the dark bars are, this sort of cut off. The dark bars are when larger plates were put out, and the light bars are where smaller plates were put out. And so they're having to refill these trays much more often when people are eating in larger plates. And they also looked at how much food people actually took onto their plate and then how much they ate. And so this, on the left, we have the small plates, on the right, we have the large plates. They're taking more food onto that larger plate, and then they're eating more of that food. The eating is, of course, negative to counteract what they've taken. So they're taking more, they're eating more, and then they're also wasting more. They're leaving more on their plates and throwing more away. So these smaller plates can get people to take less food, eat less food, and also waste less food. And so that's a sort of a nudge in a direction. People aren't necessarily making a very conscious decision to eat less. They just have this cue in front of them, and they're using that cue. Another nudge that we've tried in my lab, advanced ordering. One of the things that we find when we're trying to decide what to eat is that temptation. You see this beautiful food in front of you, that can really be our downfall. And so we want to ask, what will happen if we order our food, we choose what we're going to eat when we're not really hungry, when we're not really tempted. So we have people order hours before they're going to actually eat the meal. We tried this in a couple of different settings. I'm going to show you data from a setting where we had classrooms, morning classes that were either 10 a.m. to noon or 9 a.m. to noon. And what we did was have people order, we told them they'd be in a study and they could get a free lunch. And we either asked them to choose that lunch right before they eat at the end of class and they get their lunch immediately, or they choose their lunch at the beginning of class. So this is 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. They're presumably not very hungry, and they also don't really have this thought of food really in their mind. And what we found manipulating the time that they order lunch is that the people who order lunch at 9 or 10 in the morning end up ordering more than 100 calories less than the people who are ordering their lunch right before they're about to eat. So this is a pretty big effect size. And when we broke it down, the lunch, they could choose a sandwich and then a side dish and a sort of dessert, is that the action all, and actually we see this in study after study, a lot of the action is in these peripheral items, that it's whether they choose an apple rather than a cookie, and they choose a water rather than a Coke, things like that. These are the decisions that they're able to make in the morning, but when they're about to eat their lunch right now, then they're going to choose that cookie, they're going to choose that Coke, and they're going to sort of make these worse decisions right beforehand. This effect is only slightly mediated by hunger. So hunger is part of it, but really just having this temptation right in front of you, the thought of the food, seems to be a lot of what's going on. It's not just that I'm hungry and I want more, but I'm about to eat and I really want this really good food right now. The next nudge I want to talk about is this sort of convenience nudge in making things default options. And so here's a study by David Justin and his colleagues where they looked at school cafeterias that had 2 lines. And the kids would just go in and they could take one line or the other. And so what they did is they went into the school and they made one of these lines a convenience line, where in this one line of healthy foods were just more convenient. It was easier to choose them. And so the kids could go and find the less healthy items if they wanted to. But what they found basically was that this exploits sort of these present biased preferences, that it's easier to just get the thing that's convenient and in front of you. And it's kind of hard to go find that unhealthy food. And so by and large, they don't. And so they measured consumption of healthy versus unhealthy foods. And what you see is that the darker blue bars are when the convenience line had been introduced. The kids are choosing less of these unhealthy foods when it's not that easy for them to choose. We did another study in my lab a few years ago along these same lines, where we had people going into a sandwich shop that, contrary to its sort of reputation for being healthy that it somehow enjoys in the US, even though it's actually really not. We had people come into this sandwich shop just before they're going to go in to order their food. We asked them to do a study. And what we did was try to make the healthier options more convenient to them, exploiting these known biases, present bias preferences, and also the default bias of whatever is going to be sort of easier and seems like the natural thing to choose. And so what we did was we made a one menu very easy for them to choose from, and that featured either just sort of a mix of options like they would find if they went into the restaurant, or healthier options, lower calorie options only. And we made those non-featured options. They're still available, but they're just a little more inconvenient to get to. We did this in 2 instantiations. One, we did a pretty strong manipulation. The other, we did a more subtle manipulation. And that had some downstream consequences that are important. So let me just go through each one. With a strong manipulation, what we did was we started out with the main menu. And for some people, it was a mix. And in this case, there was the healthier options. And so they would choose which sandwich they want. And then they would get a choice of side dishes, or they can get some things are relatively healthier and some things, the cookies, 400 calories, are relatively less healthy. A choice of drink, again, they could choose a Coke or a milk. There's lots of different options. And then if they wanted to, they could get to the back of the menu, and they were told there's more sandwich options if you want them, but they actually have to break a seal and open it up. So we've got a measure of who broke open the seal, and then they could see the higher calorie options, and they were free to choose that if they wanted to. We ran the same study again with this more subtle manipulation, where we started out with the first menu and they could just check, oh, those are supposed to line up, but they could just check which sandwich they want. And then they would go past the other sandwiches. If they wanted one of those, they would have to write it down, and sort of akin to when you go to a sushi restaurant and you choose your specialty thing, you have to sort of write it out. So we would make them do that for the less convenient option, but they all saw these options. In the first manipulation, they only saw these other less healthy options if they had opened it up and really looked for them. So everybody in this study knows what they're being nudged past, and that's going to be relevant. And then they get the same choices between these side dishes and the drinks. And so just to very quickly show you the data, starting with the calories and the sandwich was the only thing that was subject to the nudge manipulation. when we nudged them, when we just gave them a mixed menu to start with, they had more calories than when we gave them that healthy menu to start with. So they're about 50 calories less if we nudge them towards this healthy menu. And with this subtle nudge, which is the one where they can see those sandwiches right after, we get a pretty similar effect. It's maybe slightly attenuated, but it's still a significant effect. But where the interesting action is in the rest of their meal that they chose. So the rest of it, everybody's making the same decisions between side dishes and drinks. Well, we had this strong nudge that a lot of times they would make their decision from that first menu. They would choose their side dish, they would choose their drink, and a lot of them wouldn't even look at what the other sandwich options were. We see the effect carry over. They get about the same amount of calories from the sides and drinks in the two conditions, because of course it's the same choices, but the benefit of the sandwich carries over in the overall meal, and so they're going away with a lower calorie meal overall. When they have this subtle nudge where we did succeed in nudging them towards the healthier option in the sandwich, but then they all know about these things that they passed up, these high-calorie, creamy, cheesy, delicious things that they're not having that they now feel pretty good about how good they've been. In that case, they compensate for it. They completely compensate for it, and the effect goes away because they feel like they've been good, and now they're free to eat that cookie, and the whole benefit completely goes away. And so, just to say a few words here about taking these kind of ideas and trying to intervene at scale, trying to sort of bring these up and really implement them in a larger population. Environmental cues that we might use about the appropriate amount of food to eat, so like plate size. This has a possible conflict with restaurants' interests. Of course, restaurants want you to feel like you've gotten a good deal, you've gotten a lot of food, you walk away thinking, oh, that was really great, I feel really stuffed, and I got a really good value for my money. That's a possible barrier to implementing at this level. But there are other domains where the incentives are better aligned. So employer cafeterias, a lot of employers offer free food. In some companies, of course, schools, kids don't really have the option to go elsewhere for school. So in a school, you really have the opportunity to implement things like plate size and try to get the kids to choose lower calorie meals without worrying about them going somewhere else, because really, where else are they going to go? Advanced ordering, this sort of idea of ordering in advance, we also had some manipulations of calorie information, found that was pretty effective, more effective in online ordering than it is in the field. And this idea of ordering your food in advance is becoming a more common phenomenon as online ordering, online delivery, sort of the ubiquity of the web, allows people to make decisions about what they're going to eat, not right when they're going to be eating it. And that might be a way that we can really scale up to make that kind of sort of facilitate that happening more often and encourage people to make their decisions in advance as opposed to when they're actually eating. And then finally, this sort of idea of choice architecture, the idea of structuring some worlds so that the healthier options are more convenient, that has some promise. We can change the convenience of options, making these low-calorie options more convenient. But we have to be careful not to highlight the foregone options and to really be mindful that the psychology of what's going on is pretty complex. And so if you think you're subtly nudging somebody towards another choice, but then they realize they've been nudged, they may feel licensed to compensate that for that in other ways. But there's some promise to scale these things up. Thank you.
Sounds extremely promising. Is there a question for Julie? Then raise your hand quickly while I'm asking Sean to approach, because he's the next speaker. Seems you were very clear, right?
Here's a question.
Here's a question.
That's not on, is it? Okay, thank you. Yes, thanks for your talk. I was wondering, I mean, those studies have been done in the US, right? What about the intercultural world? I mean, what did your research show on how do nudges work all over the world?
Yeah, so we don't have as much data, in other societies. And I think if you sort of think about conceptually what are the situations in other parts of the world and what might work, I'm trying to just think on my feet about how those could play out. A lot of times when you have people making decisions about and a lot of times you might have government influence in terms of what is being made available. I'm trying to think of, can you give me like a suggestion of how things are different in some place that might be different?
Well, I mean, we know that, or we guess that stuff like defaults would be something universal, or like status. I mean, there's these Stone Age biases that are probably out there everywhere, and other things might be more culturally. I was just interested whether you have also done your work in like different cultures or.
Yeah, I actually don't know about that much of this work that's been done in very different cultures. I mean, I think a lot of the biases that we're really working with are biases that we expect to be universal because they're linked to, how the human mind evolved. And so I think the contextual situation might be very different in terms of what are the options that you're trying to push the default toward. But I think we would anticipate the biases to be similar, but we really need to do the research to find out whether these things are going to work in other cultures.
Thank you, Julie.
Thanks.